I was diagnosed with a terminal illness, but my boyfriend didn't know. He once gave up his dream university for me. He also anxiously ran towards another woman at the scene of an accident, leaving me injured. I passed away on the day he was overseas with his female secretary. It was the day I found out I had something growing in my head. Arthur proposed to me. My mind was in chaos, and for a moment I doubted if he knew everything. In less than 30 seconds of hesitation, he stood up from the ground, put the ring box back in his pocket, and looked at me with a distant gaze. If you disagree with my parents' request, then forget it, I felt relieved in my heart. Just as I thought. He always liked to joke with me. I guess this time he thought I was pressuring him into marriage through my parents. That's why he made a mockery of the proposal. I quietly put down the outstretched hand and smiled at him. What if I agree? Will you marry me? We locked eyes, and he remained silent. The answer was crystal clear. To be honest, it was quite hurtful. You won't marry now, and you won't be able to marry in the future. I suppressed the warmth in my eyes and said stubbornly. Arthur didn't care. He took off his coat and placed it back on the sofa, with a hint of sarcasm at the corner of his mouth. Are you sure that day will come? He always had tremendous foresight. I indeed couldn't wait for that day. At night, I sat by the bed in a daze. Arthur closed his computer, relaxed his tired eyes, and got up to pull back the blanket. He habitually turned his back to me, leaving enough space for another pillow between us. Sleeping positions couldn't deceive. We had been together for 8 years, but he still couldn't get used to sleeping in the same bed with me. I always had the nerve to get close to him when he was asleep, even if he didn't want it. I would quietly snuggle up to his back, wrapping my arms around his waist. Even our first time together was initiated by my boldness. Back then, I was 20 years old. I vaguely remember it was a rainy day. The raindrops were pattering against the window glass, the air was cold and damp. I took off my little jacket and slowly walked towards him, embracing him. He stood there motionless. The waist under his white shirt was unexpectedly slim and narrow. Unlike me, his body temperature was warm. I trembled with shyness, and all I could think was that if he rejected me, my heart might break. I tilted my head and smiled at him, but tears blurred my vision. I was so afraid of hearing words like shameless or disgusting from him. After all, I was just a young girl, brave, but lacking the ability to bear the consequences. He gazed at me coldly, as if he might push me away at any moment. I fumbled with unbuttoning his shirt, my legs trembling, barely able to support myself. What are you doing? He asked. I stammered and couldn't speak. He looked down, his voice tinged with the bitterness of tears. You're even bad at this, fool. I caught a faint scent of alcohol. His girlfriend was unfaithful, feeling upset. That was my chance to step in. In the darkness, I gazed at the faint outline of the chandelier on the ceiling. When one faces death, the mind strangely becomes calm. The people I once raced to chase, the profound emotions I once held, now seemed less important than seeing the sunrise tomorrow. The next morning, the morning light outside fell on my face, leaving me feeling a bit lost. The doctor said an object was pressing on my optic nerve, causing me to take a while to focus when looking at things. Arthur leaned against the head of the bed reading a financial magazine. On weekends in the past, we would laze around in bed together, and I would always be clinging to him, with at least one limb touching him. It was an unconscious response. Arthur glanced at my shoulder, somewhat puzzled, saying, You sure slept soundly last night. I still smiled. Then, he furrowed his brow suddenly. What nonsense were you talking about in your sleep? I touched my face, it was damp. Did I cry? Afraid he would inquire further, I sat up halfway, looking at him seriously, and said, I dreamed I was in Norway, seeing the snow and the northern lights. I really want to go. Can I? I pleaded with hopeful eyes. Arthur ignored me, saying he didn't have the time. I opened my mouth slowly and smiled. Very well then. Perhaps my reaction was too indifferent, so he turned his head to glance at me for a while, and nonchalantly said, March next year, I can't make time this year. I nodded. There was still time. In fact, I dreamed of the 12-year-old Arthur. He wasn't like this before. He used to be a great brother. I had a picky tongue since childhood, shunning this and that food, but he could eat up what I left behind without any complaints. Unlike when we grew up, he wouldn't touch the cup I drank from. I was bullied at school, scribbling on my notebooks. He always stood up for me, fighting with the annoying boys, explaining to the teachers on my behalf, and even giving me his new notebook. I was very shy as a child, coming from a single-parent household, and without his protection, I would have been bullied mercilessly. When my mom passed away, I cried until I nearly fainted. I said no one wanted me anymore. He said there will always be someone who does. I repeated, and he repeated. I cried all night, and he comforted me despite his toothache. His cheeks were swollen the next day. After that, I confessed my feelings to him, throwing myself at him. He was cold and distant, calling me shameless. On Monday at work, I found his spare phone left at home and rushed to the office to give it to him. On the way, a call came in. I checked the caller ID, very intimate indeed. For so many years, he only called me by my first and last name. My mom probably named me to ensure my safety. Unfortunately, I was diagnosed with brain cancer before the age of 30, disappointing her hopeful expectations. That crossed my mind that my family had a genetic predisposition to tumors. My mom, my aunt, and my great-grandmother all passed away from cancer at a young age. When they departed, they were still very young. When I arrived at the company, Kathy stopped me, distant yet polite, saying the CEO was in a meeting and I needed to wait a moment. Kathy was his college classmate who became his secretary after graduation. She handled all of Arthur's affairs. They spent more time together every day than Arthur and I did. I was concerned because they had a brief relationship during college. Although it didn't last long, it was always a thorn in my heart. In our shared circles, everyone felt that I was demanding and possessive in front of him, not allowing any other women near him. I wouldn't dare to suggest firing Kathy. Their breakup seemed reluctant even now. At that time, Arthur looked so devastated, with eyes I had never seen before staring coldly at me. Are you only capable of pushing me through my parents? His voice was hoarse, and I even thought I saw a glint of tears in his eyes. Did you like her that much? I was stunned for a long time. He had always been reserved, and I had never seen him care so much about someone. In the past, I might have acted out of spite, waiting for Arthur to come out after the meeting and deliberately showing affection in front of Kathy. But this time, I handed the spare phone to Kathy, instructing her to return it to Arthur after the meeting. With a slight nod to her, I turned and left on my own. Kathy looked slightly surprised. Arthur's parents moved back to their secluded old mansion after retiring. I visited them every month. But Arthur was not willing to accompany me. Your parents have always liked you more than me. He was reading a contract and casually said, you can go by yourself. My mom was unmarried when she became pregnant with me. I didn't know who my father was. Arthur's mom and my mom were best friends, and after my mom passed away, they raised me together. I was very grateful to them and tried my best to be obedient, even going as far as to be ingratiating, pleasing his aunt, his uncle, and Arthur. Arthur's relationship with his parents was strained, largely because of me. He didn't know whether I was just a burden. Arthur's parents hadn't approved of his relationship with Kathy because they discovered she was being financially supported by someone else at the time. The photo evidence was shown to Arthur, but he didn't care. Kathy had her reasons. He said. Aunt pointed an accusing finger at me, blaming me for making Arthur turn against them. The last straw was when you rejected that girl. Rather than finding someone of lower class, find Irene. At least she's a good and decent young lady. Arthur smiled faintly. If you're happy, you can marry her yourself. Stepping out of the memories, I coaxed him, let's go together. They will be happier. Arthur stayed indifferent. It's fine as long as you're happy. I compromised. After staring at him for a while, I got up, picked up my bag, and said, there's food in the kitchen, remember to eat. He didn't even look up. Okay, drive safely. It took 3 hours to drive to the old mansion. I was sweet-talking and managed to get the elderly couple to laugh heartily with just a few words. I loosened the soil and fertilized for Aunt, sowed radish seeds, and set up the trellis for the pea seedlings. After sweating profusely, I unconsciously fell asleep on the stone table in the vegetable garden. When I woke up, it was dusk, and Uncle had draped his coat over me. My arms had been bitten several times by mosquitoes. The sunset was fiery and warm, bringing a sense of comfort. After dinner, it was time to leave. Aunt entrusted me to take care of Arthur. I promised. Uncle said, take care of yourself too, you look a bit worn out. Sometimes tears could be triggered by such simple caring words. I forced back the tears, smiling and saying, I won't stay up late next time. On the way back, I realized that I probably couldn't drive alone anymore. The frequency of my headaches was increasing. Calvin was my attending physician. He suggested that I be hospitalized for treatment, as the frequency of headaches might increase over time, and some people might even experience persistent seizures. I shook my head. If it got to that point, I would probably have killed myself already. You know, I can't bear the guilt. He frowned at me for a moment, then sighed that I didn't dare to drive, so he drove me back. On the way, Calvin looked at me in the rearview mirror, still not aware? He, obviously referring to Arthur. I just murmured, not sure how to say it yet. He fell silent, and I couldn't imagine his reaction. I chuckled. He should be relieved to have his freedom in the second half of his life. The thing Arthur regretted most in his life was probably when he got involved with me in his sophomore year. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been hounded by me, by his parents, insisting on taking responsibility for me. Calvin glanced at me, shook his head. I lied to him, saying that he agreed to be with me while drunk, and that my arm happened to be draped in the clothes you wore the night before. He misunderstood something between us and was furious. I said he was angry because his parents forced him to break up with Kathy. Calvin clicked his tongue, say whatever you want. As the sky darkened, passing by the sports square, a group of energetic young people were sweating profusely on the basketball court. I was momentarily stunned. Wait a moment, I said to Calvin. I don't want to go back yet. Don't you play basketball? I want to watch. Me? Calvin hesitated. I haven't played basketball in years. I can play table tennis. After some persuasion from me, Calvin rolled up his sleeves and reluctantly got on the court. He was tall and had long limbs, so after getting accustomed to it, he did quite well. When he made a beautiful three-pointer, I couldn't help but scream. Calvin wiped the sweat off his head, looking at me proudly. Not far away, I saw a familiar figure. He was wearing a shirt and trousers, with his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, looking expressionless at the basketball court. I knew that on the outer side of his arm, there was a long and hideous scar that was from the car accident when he saved me. A 20-centimeter wound, a fracture, metal pins. After that, due to nerve damage causing dysfunction of his fingers, he couldn't play his beloved baseball and basketball. He couldn't even hold a cup of water steadily. That hand once shielded me from a piece of shattered windshield coming towards us. I felt guilty about it for a long time. After the game, Calvin shook hands with his teammates, walked towards me sweating. I handed him my coat. Let's go. He looked aggrieved. I won, but didn't get a sip of water, only the one I drank, I retorted. He reached out. Give it to me. Arthur had already left at some point. Feeling awkward, I said, let's go, I'll buy water for you. When I got home, Arthur had already freshened up, wearing pajamas, lying on the bed. I took a shower, got into bed, and he turned off the light. We didn't speak all night. The next day, our planned weekend date suddenly got an extra person. The company was planning a theme park project, and I brought Kathy to see the location. Arthur explained casually. I didn't say anything. We walked for a while, and Kathy seemed to have caught a cold, coughing continuously. Arthur frowned. Why didn't you say you were sick? Kathy laughed. I've had a cold for several days. I thought taking medicine was enough, but it got worse when I came outside. Arthur took off his coat and handed it to her. Kathy wrapped herself. Thank you for your concern, boss. It was overcast, and the wind was strong, showing no signs of abating, stinging the cheeks. Arthur found a cafe, but it was full except for the seats near the door. He made her sit by the wall to avoid the draft. Maybe due to the cold wind blowing, my headache started again, and I was breaking out in cold sweat all over. My legs went weak, and I instinctively grabbed Arthur's arm. He glanced down at me. Are you sick too? The tone wasn't exactly concerned, but there was a hint of ridicule. I tried to steady myself, letting go of his arm. I had barely eaten breakfast, feeling a bit of low blood sugar. He didn't say anything. I told him, I'll go to the bathroom. He grunted. I turned around, took a deep breath, my headache making it nearly impossible to think clearly, and then a warm liquid trickled down my nostrils. Several guests passing by showed surprise. I covered my mouth and nose, lowered my head, and hastened my steps to the bathroom. I locked the cubicle door. Called Calvin for advice. The call went unanswered for a long time, a nauseating sensation rising in me, and I vomited heavily in the toilet bowl. The stomach acid burned my throat. After throwing up, my headache eased a bit. I leaned against the wall, resting for a while. I splashed cold water on my forehead, washed my face, and walked out through the cafe's side door. Upon my return, I found Kathy coughing quite severely, and Arthur was gently patting her back. My eyes suddenly felt a bit sour. Perhaps it was jealousy stirring. I approached, placing ammonium chloride and loquat syrup in front of her, asking the pharmacy. They said these could help with her cough. Kathy accepted them, somewhat surprised. Thank you, Irene. Arthur's gaze remained fixed on her, not sparing me a glance. You also don't seem to be feeling well? Unexpectedly, it was Kathy who noticed that something was off with me. Arthur's eyes then turned to me, with a somewhat skeptical look. I smiled, just feeling a bit uncomfortable in my stomach. He calmly said, let's finish our snacks and head back early. I nodded. In the car, Calvin returned my call, apologizing for not answering earlier due to a reprimand from his boss. What's wrong? Do you need something? I glanced at Arthur in the driver's seat and whispered, just feeling a bit of discomfort in my stomach, wondering what medication to take. It's okay now, I added. After a moment of silence, Calvin said, let's talk when you get back. I couldn't help but smirk. He's always been clever like that. Arthur turned to Kathy, let's go to the hospital. Get in for drip. After some hesitation, Kathy agreed. Arthur then glanced at me through the rearview mirror. What about you? Do you need to go to the hospital for a checkup? I shook my head. Drop me off here, I'll take a taxi back on my own. He didn't react much, as you wish. I gazed out the car window. Sometimes, I couldn't help but wonder, if Arthur knew I was dying, would he regret treating me like this? But then I quickly realized, what does it matter to him? It was my decision to keep it from him. A few minutes later, Arthur dropped me off at a street corner. Kathy looked at me apologetically. The car quickly drove away. I stood there for a while, waved down a passing cart. I didn't go home. I bought a pack of beer from a convenience store and went to the riverside, drinking it while enjoying the river breeze. I wasn't in the mood to make a fuss. I only drank half the can, holding the rest in my hand. Because of the cold, I also bought a shawl from a clothing store nearby. Calvin once asked me why I didn't tell my family I was sick. Before my mother passed away, I was the one taking care of her. Her appearance in her last moments, looking withered, blood vessels visibly shrinking, needles unable to pierce her. That became my most profound memory of her. Whenever I recalled it, it felt like a dark cloud hanging over my heart, haunting me in my midnight dreams. The despair and sorrow of seeing a loved one tortured by illness relentlessly persisted. My death didn't have to be this way. Instead of letting them accompany me through meaningless treatments, witnessing my gradual decline into weakness and misery, it'd be better to have them remember me in my healthy and beautiful state. After that, Calvin could tell them that I left gracefully, that medical technology is advanced now, and I didn't suffer. I sat there alone for a long time, hugging my knees, and before I realized it, the sky had almost darkened. I turned on my phone to find many missed calls. I randomly picked one and called back. Arthur sounded angry, as if he wanted to scold me. I've called you so many times, why didn't you answer? It took me a moment to realize that I had missed something important. What's wrong? Is everything okay? He fell silent for a while, his breath heavy, as if trying to control his emotions. Where are you? I glanced around. Lujeong-deok. Stay put, I'll come to pick you up, he said. I wrapped the shawl tightly, obediently waiting for him in place. Arthur arrived faster than I expected, and when he parked the car and approached me, his gaze quickly scanned me up and down. Seeing that I was fine, he calmed down. What are you doing here? He asked. I was about to answer when I sneezed. His face turned sour, and he took off his coat to wrap me in it. It was something I didn't want, as the coat had been draped on Kathy's shoulders at noon. Somewhat reluctantly, I took it off discreetly after following him. Arthur opened the car door, suddenly turning around to look at me, furrowing his brow. What? I whispered. Kathy wore it before. I don't want something that's touched by her. Being dramatic? Well, maybe. If I'm almost dying. There's no need for me to be so understanding, right? Who says that? He took the coat back and wrapped it around me again, his brow relaxing. She wore it, and so should you. Are you unsatisfied with your health condition? Inside the car, he turned on the heater. It's too hot, I complained. Deservedly so, he retorted. After the car accident, Arthur became very cautious about driving, taking over 10 minutes to cover a 5-kilometer distance. When I entered the door, he suddenly grabbed my hand, lowered his head to smell the alcohol on me. How much did you drink? 1 can. He obviously didn't believe it. I wanted to explain, but as soon as I spoke, I sneezed several times in a row. He placed his palm on my forehead to feel for fever. Are you running a temperature? Maybe it was from sneezing too hard, causing something in my nasal cavity to start flowing out. Arthur frowned. What's wrong with you? I shook my head, using my hand to cover my nose. Maybe it's just a heatiness. Blood gushed out of my nose like a faucet that wasn't turned off properly. Arthur's expression suddenly changed, telling me to tilt my head back and pinching my nostrils. He rummaged through the bedroom to find medical cotton balls to stuff into my nose. He stared at me intently, with precise and careful movements. The nosebleed gradually stopped, leaving my face and neck sticky with blood. Arthur brought a warm towel to wipe me clean, and as he wiped down my chest, his hand hesitated slightly. I pulled at his sleeve, pointing out a small blood stain. You've got blood on you. He didn't seem to mind, focusing on my face, eyebrows furrowing, getting a nosebleed from just sneezing. Are you made of porcelain? I nodded, admitting frankly, I am just a bit fragile. It was the truth. He looked me over. Have you lost weight? He still remembered my weight. Arthur went to the kitchen and cooked a bowl of fragrant noodles. Then he watched as I finished the entire bowl. It had been a long time since I felt so full. My belly bulged, making it hard to move. He brought me pajamas, crouching down to help me change shoes, his stray hair falling over his eyes, exuding patience and gentleness. For a moment, I thought I had returned to the past. Back then, due to my picky eating habits and poor nutrition, he stopped indulging me and corrected my tastes. Actually, there were many things I wanted to ask him. With his exceptional grades, he could have gone to a top 5 national university, so why did he choose to stay at our university? At that time, he said it was because the university was closer to home and he wouldn't be bothered by family. Was that the truth? Or was he afraid of me going to a faraway place to study alone and being bullied? But I never got the words out. Arthur received a phone call. He stood up and walked aside, his tone and demeanor very gentle. Yes, she has been found. Some things are destined by fate. If he hadn't come to our university, he wouldn't have met Kathy. Although Kathy eventually couldn't withstand the pressure and ended up with another guy, over the years, these two people still shared a deep connection. Arthur, I don't have much time left. Accompany me through this, and you will be free. My birthday is in a month. Lately, I have clearly felt my health deteriorating. The dosage of painkillers is increasing, but I am feeling more pain. Calvin also told me that my condition is not optimistic. I clung tightly to Arthur, repeating in his ear, take me to see the Northern Lights, okay? I thought we had agreed on next year? He replied, I can't wait. Do you know the significance of the Northern Lights? It symbolizes luck. Those who see the Northern Lights will have a lifetime of happiness. Arthur, irritated by my persistence, finally relented. Fine. Really? Yes. My eyes lit up, and I hugged his neck tightly, planting a kiss on his nose. Arthur was momentarily stunned, his muscles tensed, but he didn't push me away. Our relationship eased a bit. The most direct change was that Arthur became more assertive. Although we had been intimate before, he seemed to put in more effort lately. Setting aside these thoughts, I still cherish this time together. If it weren't for those unresolved romantic entanglements, he was at least a responsible brother. Life is always full of surprises. After enduring for so long, I was close to my birthday. That day, I went out to buy some things I would need for an overseas trip, but on the way, I was struck by a motorbike. Curled up on the ground, pale-faced, the driver was scared and wanted to call an ambulance for me, but I stopped him and called Calvin instead. He should have been off today. Calvin arrived quickly, picking me up as I convulsed in pain, putting me in the car, and giving me a sedative. I slowly came to, and even in that state, I joked with him, when I die, I'll leave half of my inheritance to you. You're more responsible than a boyfriend. In the midst of his busyness, he shot me a glare. I don't want your inheritance. So, what do you want? I didn't have anything worthy to offer. He thought for a moment, make me a meal, that's what I want. I chased after you because your cooking was so delicious. I had been cooking for Arthur for so many years, but he never fell for me. We went to the market to buy ingredients. With a grateful heart, I was ready to showcase my skills. Midway through cooking, Arthur called me, asking, "What's going on?" "Someone at the company said they saw you being hit on the road today." I hesitated, not expecting him to know. "Just a small accident, nothing serious." He took a deep breath. "Where are you now?" Calvin handed me the prepared shrimp, all cleaned and deveined. Should have bought shrimp without heads and shells to begin with, it's too much trouble. Arthur heard Calvin's voice and fell silent. I had to say, "Calvin helped me, I'm making him dinner at his place." Then, "It's fine." He spoke in a deep voice before hanging up. I exchanged a glance with Calvin. He shrugged. At night, Arthur came back very late. I joyfully skipped to him with a warm glass of milk. "What date are we going to Norway?" "I'll book the tickets." Arthur looked up, didn't take the milk, didn't say a word. In the silence that followed, I had a premonition. Indeed. He lowered his gaze. "Sorry, a challenging project in the UK has been handed over to us. I need to be on site to oversee the project from start to finish. It will take at least 6 months. Unconsciously, I gripped the mug tightly. In the past, of course, I would have understood. Work comes first. I understood that principle. I was a bit stubborn. But I had never interfered with his work. Could it be postponed? Even if we just went to Norway. We wouldn't stay for long. I said, somewhat bewildered, even with a hint of pleading. Perhaps surprised by my persistence, he looked at me. "Next year, we'll go. You can stay as long as you want." After a long pause, I murmured in agreement. But there was no chance. Maybe feeling a bit guilty, in bed, I turned away from him, and Arthur embraced me from behind, planting delicate kisses on my neck and shoulders. I didn't respond, and he didn't get angry either. He gradually kissed me, even his fingers kissing each one individually, starting gently and gradually becoming more intense. After 5 months apart, it seemed like he wanted to make up for lost time. The next morning, he packed his things quickly. Kathy drove the car to the front yard. "Arthur bid me goodbye. I will find time to come back." After saying that, he prepared to leave. I asked, "Won't you give me a hug before you go?" After a half-second hesitation, he leaned in. Kathy peeked out of the car. "Boss, it's time to leave." Arthur hesitated for a moment. Right, he was never very affectionate towards me in front of others. He looked at me, "Wait for me to come back." Then he turned and walked towards Kathy. Out of habit, I counted. 1 step. 2 steps. 3 steps, 10 steps, he didn't look back. I always hoped he would look back at me, even just a glance, to show that he didn't want to leave. Unfortunately, this time was no exception. I slept for a long time. By the time I woke up, it was already early morning. The night was cool, and the entire city was silent. Arthur messaged me to let me know he had arrived in the UK. I didn't reply. I couldn't sleep anymore, sitting on the bed hugging my legs. It was fine. I didn't want him to know about my illness in the first place, and since he was overseas, he wouldn't find out about my death. In a daze, I remembered many things from the past. When I was a child and had poor health, I was prone to allergies and had nasal problems, so whenever it was my turn for class duties, he would come to our class to sweep the floor and clean the blackboard for me. When I slipped and fell on the snowy ground during winter, he put gloves on my hands and carried me home on his back. When I had a cold and sore throat and couldn't eat, with no adults at home, he cooked porridge and fed me spoon by spoon, blowing on it to cool it down. And that time there was a car accident. If he hadn't shielded me in front of him, I might have died. Every time he treated me badly, it would be counteracted by all the good things he had done for me in the past. Day by day, year by year, these instances of cancellation and recancellation accumulated. I still liked him very much. Because some memories require many instances of bad behavior to cancel out. And the many good things he did for me were just immeasurable. I walked barefoot into Arthur's study. He rarely allowed me in there. In a dusty corner of the bookshelf, I found an art book. Arthur used to love painting. Besides various sketches, I came across a sentence. "I know Irene doesn't have a mother, it's pitiful, but I don't like her." The handwriting was somewhat youthful, written by a young Arthur. I hesitated for a moment. I continued flipping through. After she came home, Mom and Dad's eyes were only on her. During car rides, because she gets car sick, she is always cradled in Mom's arms. The things I like to eat, she doesn't like, so Mom and Dad only make what she likes. When I fell ill, no one noticed. My heart felt heavy. So when I appeared, Aunt and Uncle showed him so much neglect. He was just a child at the time, why should he be so generous to someone unrelated who suddenly appeared and took away his parents' attention and loved? The diary entries started to increase gradually. She picked up a rain-soaked kitten, didn't feed it, and cried uncontrollably. I hugged her, and she immediately held on to me. Tears and snot smeared on me, dirty. My parents forgot my birthday, but she didn't forget. She even went around the whole class announcing, getting the teacher and the whole class to sing me a birthday song. I didn't dare to look up the whole time, too embarrassed. I don't let her call me brother, but she doesn't listen. I am not her brother. Does being her brother mean I have to give in to everything? That's what my parents said. Will she call any male brother? Most of the book is filled with drawings. Occasionally he would write down something important. Today I heard her talking to the cat's grave. If I don't please him, I'm afraid Uncle and Aunt will send me away. At that moment, I felt quite sad. My eyes are a bit dry. When I was young, I really hoped that my uncle and aunt and he were all part of the same family. My liking for Arthur also mixed into this obsession. I really want a home. But that doesn't mean I don't really love him. After Arthur became an adult, he rarely wrote in his diary. Flipping to the last page, there was only one sentence: she seems to think I'm drunk. Fool, men can't be drunk. The pages are old and stuck together. I tore open the second to last page. There was another entry: Kathy is quite similar to me. I find many similarities in her, even the stains on our souls are the same. Maybe she can be my girlfriend. I was stunned for a moment. So in the end, he realized that Kathy was his soulmate. It turns out, my childhood memories were different from his. It turns out, I hindered him so much that I picked up a pen and wrote a few words on the back of that sketchbook: I'm sorry. My head started to ache again. When the pain came, my whole body was in pain. Are the painkillers not working anymore? I looked at myself in the mirror. To be honest, I don't look very good. The baby fat is finally gone. Arthur doesn't like sister-like. Maybe he will like me this way. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to call me his old aunt. Struggling with pain, trembling and restless, when my will blurred, I couldn't help but think of calling Arthur. My fingers touched his number. In the end, I still didn't press the button. I am a very selfish person. I have many dark thoughts. I know Arthur doesn't like me, but I still force him to be with me, using responsibility as leverage to at this time let it go. On my birthday, Arthur called me many times. I watched the phone screen light up and go dark. I finally answered. Why did you pick up so slowly? His end was a bit noisy. Fell asleep. I whispered. Have you eaten the cake? He asked. I nodded. Ate it. Were Mom and Dad with you? How dare I let Aunt and Uncle see me like this? So I lied to them, saying I went on a trip. Wanted to see the other side of the world and would be back after a long time. No. I smiled and said, I celebrated with friends. He fell silent for a second. Calvin? He is indeed the closest friend I have kept in contact with over the years. Yeah, he bought the cake, but annoyingly got the age wrong by a year. He even advised me that since I was older by the month, 1 year makes no difference. He is really annoying. In fact, I haven't seen him for a long time. Arthur mumbled. I have been having stomach aches and heartaches recently, rolling on the ground in pain. I wanted to act coquettishly, but my voice was hoarse, so the effect was not very good. Can you come back soon? I want to see you. Have you heard the story of the boy who cried wolf? When Arthur and Kathy were about to go on a business trip, I also wanted to go with them. Arthur didn't agree, so I threatened to commit suicide the night before they left, saying he wouldn't take me. I won't live it. I was just saying on impulse, never thought he would believe it. Arthur hurried over. I sat cross-legged on the floor, holding an unsharpened Western knife and pointing it at my wrist. His initial anxious expression immediately turned cold. After that, every time I wasn't feeling well, Arthur would be very impatient. The more I urged him to come back, the less likely he would return. I knew this very well. As expected, he coldly said, "Wait until work is over, then hung up the phone. To make him like me is not easy. I have not succeeded even after 20 years. But to make him dislike me, I know exactly what to do. When he finds out about my death, maybe he will feel a little less sad. If he still cares about me. 1 month later. I was listening to music at a bar, next to Arthur's friends, both male and female. I wore a duckbill cap, with the brim pressed down low, dressed in all black, curled up in a corner, so they didn't recognize me. From their gossip, I heard my name. It turns out Arthur, he wants to break up with me. He said it's been dragging on for too long, both of us are tired and fed up. After thinking for a while, I started to pack up my things at home. Clothes, shoes, toothbrush, toothpaste, and some of the so-called tacky aesthetically pleasing decorations I forced in, big and small, the parts that belonged to me, I collected them all. This way, when his new girlfriend moves in, she won't argue with him over seeing the things I left behind. I packed these miscellaneous items, most of them were taken to the trash, and some were sold secondhand. Among them were the wedding photos we took, which we took while traveling abroad as a family. Aunt and uncle also had a copy. I used to cherish them a lot, hanging them in the most prominent position at home. But this couldn't be sold secondhand, so I had to throw it away. Before leaving, I took a last look at this home. All traces of me were gone. Wait. I left a big teddy bear on the living room sofa. The reason I bought it was because I thought it was very similar to Arthur. I left a note on it. Teddy bear is for Kathy. How much does Arthur like Kathy? Once we were in a car together, I was driving. Arthur was in the passenger seat. Kathy was sitting behind me. When the out-of-control truck hit us, Arthur shielded me from flying rocks, but the deformed car trapped me, both legs stuck under the steering wheel, the broken glass cutting into my thighs, blood flowing. Perhaps due to the body's self-defense mechanism, at that moment I felt numb, I couldn't even feel the pain. I heard Kathy's painful moans from behind me. Arthur, despite his broken arm, got out of the car, opened the door for her, and carried her out. Only then did he have the strength to attend to me. When did Arthur return to the country, and why didn't anyone tell me? I saw him get out of a taxi at the community entrance. My face turned pale, panicked, and didn't know what to do. I just thought, I can't let him see me like this. Perhaps sensing my gaze, he turned to look in my direction. I turned around, somewhat embarrassed, and quickened my pace. I rented a small house nearby. When I got home, I breathed a sigh of relief, and Arthur's call came. He must have returned home and found me missing. I composed myself, answered the call. Hello? Arthur's somewhat cold voice came through. Where are you? I didn't answer. He asked again, with a hint of pressure. Where are you? My mind was in a mess, and I made up an excuse, saying I went on a trip. He chuckled. Does traveling involve moving all your things out? I thought the house had been burgled. What do you mean? I want to move out and live on my own. He took a light breath. When he spoke again, the displeasure in his voice was almost palpable. I'll ask you again, where are you? After thinking for a moment, I tightened my grip on the phone and said, let's break up. He fell silent. I hung up the phone. 2 days later, in the middle of the night, I quietly went back to the original villa. The teddy bear I left behind was thrown in the yard. It had been rained on, dirtied out. With his temper, being treated like that by me, he definitely couldn't bear it. I touched its ears, and took it with me. It was difficult and ridiculous to carry it, even more so to stuff it on the back seat of a taxi. I still had some selfishness, hoping that he and Kathy would occasionally think of me in the future. Yet, also hoping he wouldn't care about me at all. If I died, can't Arthur taste my cooking, hear my voice, not see me annoying him every day? Would he miss me? My weight had dropped a lot. I feel that I am not far from the most embarrassing point in Calvin's mouth. Euthanasia is not legal in China, which is frustrating, and I don't want to go to Switzerland where I'm unfamiliar. With my current physical condition, I can't endure such turmoil and exhaustion. Calvin said if I wanted to go, he could take me. When he said this, there was a hint of reluctance in his eyes. I turned to look at him. Wouldn't it be too cruel for you to send me away yourself? He will definitely have nightmares in the future. After thinking for a long time, I decided to go jump into the sea. Rivers, lakes, oceans. Arthur doesn't like the sea. He likes winding streams, wide rivers, tranquil lakes, but not the mysterious vast ocean. He is a really uninteresting person. This way, when I die, he will be spared the trouble. so he won't have to think of me ruining the scenery. Although Calvin refused, I still left half of my inheritance to him in the will. Whether as a friend or a doctor, he has been too caring, and I have nothing good to repay him with. I feel ashamed as I don't have much money. I originally intended to record a video for my uncle and aunt, but considering my current condition, I decided against it and wrote a thank you letter instead. I've always wanted to call them mom and dad since I was young, so I used those terms in the letter, hoping they wouldn't mind that the sea breeze was howling mournfully in my ears. I saw a picture that Arthur posted on his social media, he and Kathy watching fireworks in the UK. I remember Kathy saying that she missed the fireworks from her childhood, carrying the most innocent and beautiful wishes. Different shapes of fireworks bloomed in the night sky, colorful and dazzling, bursting into sparkling starlight before falling down like a meteor shower. It resembled the most vibrant depiction of life. I placed my phone on a rock and plunged into the sea. When I informed Arthur of Irene's death, he furrowed his brows, not believing it, thinking it was a joke. Arthur, I'm not joking, I said as I handed him Irene's letter intended for his parents. He didn't take it, didn't even look down to read it. What was she up to now? I chuckled to myself. Arthur, Irene's body has been found by the authorities. You can go to the morgue to confirm if it's her. With those words, I left without looking back at his reaction. 7 days after Irene's death, Arthur returned from abroad. His parents couldn't reach Irene and reported her missing. The police found me through clues, and I explained to them what had happened. At the same time, I received timed emails from Irene. She told me that she passed away, not to miss her too much, and shared the password to her rented apartment, asking me to deliver her letter to her uncle and aunt. She mentioned she had written a detailed recipe book for me, so I could learn to make the dishes she used to cook if I ever missed them. There were also pickled peppers and kimchi in the fridge she made, enough to last me a long time. She hadn't contacted me in a while, so I had a premonition. She died on such an ordinary day. She didn't tell anyone, including me. I'm a medical student. The cafeteria food at her school was delicious, so I would go there for lunch every day. I have a picky eating habit. Over time, she noticed and would glance in my direction every time. When her bike broke down, I helped her fix it as I passed by, and that's how we met. She probably thought my family was very poor, eating only one meal a day, a plate of fried cakes. So she would purposely order an extra portion of meat each time, pretending she couldn't finish it, and asked me to share it with her. I found her performances amusing and played along for a long time. Until one day, she arrived every week with a bag full of fruits, snacks, and daily necessities, claiming her dorm mates wanted to lose weight and asked me to help finish them. I couldn't stand it anymore, so I dressed up in branded clothes and carried a Prada triangular bag to meet her. Most girls would recognize this brand, right? She was quite surprised when she looked at my bag carefully, pointing at it, saying it seemed like that thing. Her expression changed, probably thinking it was a knockoff, but also afraid of hurting my self-esteem. She praised it, saying it looked nice. I couldn't help but want to laugh. She was always doing things like that. After her death, she left half of her inheritance to me. When I saw the string of numbers in my bank account, I couldn't help but laugh. And as I laughed, I sat on the ground, covering my eyes filled with tears. Arthur probably confirmed it at the morgue. When he came out, his fists clenched tightly, his expression distant. As a doctor, I know what a body looks like after being in the water for a while. It would probably haunt him for the rest of his life. The police handed him the phone they found on the rock, still with some battery left. The lock screen password was easy to guess. It was the day her childhood cat died, similar to many of her passwords being her mother's birthday. This girl was strangely persistent. Maybe because her mother passed away early, she once told me to cherish every family member. That little cat was her family. She also said I was her family too. When the screen lit up, Arthur's social media appeared. He and Kathy were watching fireworks in the UK, immersed in romance and beauty. That was the last scene she saw before she died. How did she feel at that moment? Arthur's face was pale. Days later, Arthur suddenly found me. He asked me when she discovered she was sick. I said, on the day you proposed to her. His eyelids flickered. The day I proposed? Yes. I leaned back in my chair, peering at him curiously. But you said at the time that you didn't actually want to marry her. It was just your parents' request. He seemed to understand something, his eyes instantly turning red. That's why. That's why what? I chuckled. That's why was she so upset at the time? Clearly, she was more concerned about your well-being than Kathy's cold. Arthur looked up at me suddenly, disbelief in his eyes. I smiled. But you were with Kathy that whole time, weren't you? Watching the fireworks? There was one occasion where you, Kathy, and her were together, and she had a nosebleed in a store due to a headache. She hid in the bathroom until she felt better before joining you guys outside. She actually called me that day, but I missed the call. Arthur raised his head, his eyes filled with disbelief. I giggled. Compared to her, you were clearly more concerned about Kathy's cold. Arthur's expression turned dismayed, unable to return to reality. A nurse gently knocked on the door. Calvin, there's a patient's family looking for you. I passed him by and walked out. Outside the door stood Arthur's parents. His aunt's eyes were swollen from crying, relying on his uncle for support to stand steady. You're Irene's attending physician and friend. Can you tell us if Irene really had cancer? His aunt reached out to me, her voice trembling. Why didn't you tell us anything? I quickly grasped her arm. Aunt, please accept my condolences. She spent her last days alone without anyone there for her. She suffered a lot, his aunt said, tears streaming down her face. I brought out a prepared statement. Aunt, don't be too sad. Nowadays, medical technology is very advanced. Irene didn't suffer much. She just didn't want to spend her last days relying on medication and machines. She chose to jump into the sea. She loved the sea. And for her, it was a kind of release. She didn't want to see you all mourning for her, so she didn't tell you anything. His uncle stood there, eyes red, voice choked with tears. Is that so? I nodded. She said she wanted you to remember her as the lively and healthy Irene. Aunt murmured. She also reminded me about my high blood pressure. She asked me to take my medication on time, have regular checkups, and even said she wanted her uncle to supervise me so I wouldn't drink alcohol. Even on the day she died, my Irene called to check on me. I sat slumped on a chair in the hospital corridor, tears streaming down my face. I hadn't realized anything was wrong with her. Arthur stood beside me, knowing the truth. That's why he was even more distressed. Just like me. 1 month after Irene's death, I sometimes forget this fact. Waking up in my familiar bed in the morning, I instinctively turned to look at the other side, wanting to push her foot off me. But I touched emptiness. She was no longer there. She would never be there again. I sat there in a daze, suddenly remembering how in her last days, she rarely clung to me like that. A week later, I started to regain my sanity. I gave up on the project in the UK to stay in my home country and take care of my grieving parents who couldn't overcome Irene's death. I shut and listed Irene's house with a real estate agent. There was nothing to evade. She had tidied up the house so well, leaving nothing related to her behind. She left behind a teddy bear. The note said to give it to Kathy. I remember her saying I looked very much like that teddy bear. With a tinge of unknown anger, I threw it into the yard. One day, my mother suddenly suggested, let's go to the place where Irene passed away and take a look. Mentioning Irene, her eyes started to tear up again. I've been dreaming of that sea. Maybe Irene wants to see me. After my mom's statement, both she and my dad looked at me. I served my mom a dish. I can have the driver take you there. My mom looked at me. Aren't you going to see Irene? That was just a piece of sea, and besides, I have always been afraid of the sea. Dad nodded. Arthur was even afraid to go to the aquarium when he was little. Forget it. Let's go. The TV was showing the stunning aurora in Canada. The night sky seemed to be injected with a fluorescent green dye that was constantly changing. I turned away, packed the dishes into the sink, and turned on the faucet. Mom brought back a seashell from the beach and placed it by the bedside. Dad said she was calling out Irene's name at the time. The seashell was brought to her by the waves, as if it was a gift from Irene. Other than that, life went on as usual. Kathy coughed during the meeting. I looked up at her and told her to leave. Kathy was stunned, and everyone in the meeting looked at me in surprise. She hurriedly apologized and left the meeting room quickly, covering her mouth with her hand. I withdrew my gaze and gestured for the staff on the stage to continue the presentation. Kathy hid in the pantry wiping away tears. I walked over without a word and poured her a cup of coffee, paying attention to her emotions in the company. Kathy took the coffee from my hand, looking a bit embarrassed, and said thank you, boss. As I was about to leave, I suddenly heard her say, I'm not crying because of what happened in the meeting. She hoarsely said, I'm just thinking about the last time I talked to Irene. She bought me some medicine and told me that taking this would help with my cough. She must have been in a lot of pain at that time. Boss, do you know? When we had the car accident, Irene watched as you helped me out of the car. Her expression was very sad, the kind of sadness that only girls can understand. I guess that she probably misunderstood. She always thought that after the car accident, the first person you wanted to save was me. I was stunned for a moment. At that time, Irene's leg was trapped under the deformed hood of the car. Her whole face turned pale. Kathy groaned in pain in the back seat, and as I got out of the car, I helped her out first. She was very scared and unconsciously grabbed my clothes tightly. I comforted her for a few moments before she finally relaxed, as if waking up from a dream. I asked a passerby to call an ambulance for us. Then I checked on Irene's condition. She was wedged in tightly, and I tried to recline the driver's seat to create space for Irene to pull her leg out, but the seat adjustment button was malfunctioning, so I had to first clear the glass shards embedded in her wound and wait for the rescue. She was usually someone who was very afraid of pain, but at that moment, she didn't make a sound. She just stared at my broken arm and said she was fine, really fine. But later, when she saw Calvin in the hospital, she cried out in pain with teary eyes. That's when I understood that in her heart, maybe she didn't trust me as much as she trusted Calvin. Kathy said in a low voice, "But I know, you helped me out first in order to recline the seat to give her more space, right?" I didn't answer. That night, I saw a notification on my phone. How painful is it to jump into the sea to end one's life? Someone shared their own experience in the comments, saying in the midst of it, they regretted, they struggled, but there was no turning back. It was a feeling of despair, wanting to breathe but inhaling seawater into their lungs, the burning sensation in the respiratory tract. I didn't finish reading it. After that day, I started to have sleepless nights, and when I couldn't sleep, I cooked, cleaned, and ironed every piece of clothing. My mom was surprised to see a table full of dishes early in the morning. She took a bite, her eyes slightly red, as if the taste was reminiscent of something Irene used to make. I picked up a piece of red-cooked pork and put it in my mouth. The familiar taste filled my lips and teeth, but a sense of sorrow surged in my chest, as if triggering a memory buried deep in my mind. Before this, I had never cooked before. Why was I able to make dishes with a taste similar to hers? I suddenly realized everything I was doing was something Irene used to do. Each of these were habits she had when she couldn't sleep. A few days later, the real estate agent told me that the house had attracted a buyer and asked when I could sign the contract. I returned to the previous villa. Without her things, the interior seemed empty. The childish and exaggerated murals were gone, the stuffed animal pillows on the sofa were gone, the potted plants she had raised on the balcony were removed. Even the wedding photo we took during our trip was gone. Only the cold and simple furnishings remained. I stood there still, suddenly wanting to find traces of her presence in this house. But there was not a trace to be found. Desperately searching every corner, yet finding nothing. Where was that bear? I hurriedly ran to the corner of the yard, but that bear was long gone. Perhaps taken away by the cleaners as trash. The last thing she left me was also lost by me. I returned home and found the clothes she had bought for me in the past, large and small, spread them out on the bed, and then laid down on them. I didn't deliberately try to fall asleep, but soon drifted off. There was a faint and gentle breath in my ear, like a cat, so faint, extremely long sleep. The door opened, footsteps approached. I suddenly woke up, walked out of the room, and down the stairs. When I saw the person, my heart skipped a beat. But it was just the real estate agent. He came with a client to view the house. They looked surprised to see me, and he chuckled, "Arthur is here too? Perfect, you should get to know each other." I covered my eyes, took a deep breath, and said, "I'm sorry, I can't sell the house." I went to find Calvin, asking him about Irene's last place of residence. He looked at me for a moment and smiled. "I have already bought that house, you don't need to think about it anymore." I was taken aback. He stood up, walked over to me. "I know you want to find her belongings, to know how her last days were spent, but you no longer have that chance." I remained silent for a moment, looked up at him, and said, "In fact, I am very envious of you. Envious of the things she did. You understand her better than I do. Envious that when she was injured and needed help, the first person she thought of was you, not me. Obviously, before you appeared, she only depended on me." Calvin smiled slowly. "Arthur, that's because you're not deserving of it." I returned to the villa again. But since that day, I could no longer feel her presence around me. I started to remember many things. My mom had doubts about Kathy, and was also afraid of me being with a girl like Kathy again, so she tried to match me with Irene. That day, after drinking with friends, when we returned home, she suddenly entered my house. Like a rabbit caught in the rain, red-eyed, clearly not understanding anything, yet daring to unbutton my shirt for me. In that moment, I thought. You see, my parents wanted her to be with me, and she really came. That night, she must have been very scared, shaking all the time, and later, she kept crying. Later, I proposed to her. Her expression was complex, surprised, hesitant, suspicious. But there was no sign of joy. So I thought, maybe she didn't want to marry me. So I said those words that I regret to this day whenever I recall them. I didn't expect it to come true. The next day, I went to the study to organize some important things and found a thick album tucked away in a corner of the shelf. I opened it and saw that before Irene came, my childhood was actually quite lonely, most of the time spent drawing alone. After she arrived, I turned the album into a diary. It recorded everything related to her. Flipping through it in college, I added a couple of notes in passing. I closed the album, about to put it back, when I suddenly caught sight of fresh handwriting on the back. I'm sorry. It was Irene's handwriting. My hand trembled suddenly. Did she see it? Did she commit suicide because she saw this diary? I was always expected to be a person who met the standards. So although I felt that the adopted girl from my family had taken away the care and love, even though I disliked her, didn't want her to be there, but had to pretend to be a good brother, taking care of her, protecting her. My parents didn't allow me to have a temper, nor did they allow me to have selfish desires since childhood. If I just broke a toy, they would look at me with disappointed eyes. Later I met Kathy, and found something in common with her. She had a mother who favored boys over girls, a brother with leukemia, and no money for treatment, so she volunteered to be kept by a married man, asking that man to give the money to her mother to treat her brother. Once, when she finished a call to her family and I saw her, her expression turned to disgust at the moment she hung up, softly saying it would be better off dead. When she turned and saw me, she was surprised, not knowing how to explain herself. Later, when her brother really died, she was relieved, and ended things with that man. But rumors started at school. She and the man, who was much older than her, were seen entering and leaving hotels together, and pictures were circulating everywhere. She explained that he was an uncle. But no one believed her. This girl with a bad reputation, if she got close to any man, rumors of scandal would follow. This time I was the lead in the scandal. When my mom angrily accused me that day, I suddenly felt tired. She said she would rather me be with Irene. I laughed. Do as you please, you can marry her yourself. My mom slapped me. Irene followed behind me, wanting to speak, but not daring to. My parents were so far away, how could they possibly know about what was going on between me and Kathy? I looked at her coldly. Are you just using my parents to pressure me? Irene hurriedly explained that it wasn't her. And it really wasn't her. It was just a professor at the school who was familiar with my mom. But at that time, I didn't apologize to Irene. I really didn't want to see her at that time. She had a man by her side, Calvin from the medical school. I had never seen her being so interested in any opposite sex before. They would have lunch together in the cafeteria every day, happily carrying a big bag of snacks to meet him, and even asked me while shopping online, what brand of shaver do guys usually use? I glanced at her and asked why she was asking that. She hesitantly said it was for her roommate. But the truth was, I saw her give Calvin a razor along with a bag of fruits, and even touched her own chin in front of him, asking him to be more refined. In that moment, the kind of shock and anger I felt took me by surprise, even to myself. Perhaps all those days of not truly accepting her, of reluctantly caring for her against my will, had slowly worn away at me. Since the moment she cried and hugged me over the death of the cat, I realized I didn't find her so unbearable. She was the only place in this house where I could breathe. But she didn't know how stubborn I could be, didn't know how a childish boy like me could be so double-tongued. She believed until her death that I loathed her. Until her death, she thought I loved Kathy. What kind of emotions were in her heart when she wrote those 4 words? All the deliberately concealed pain, all the details of how I hurt and disappointed her that I intentionally avoided, the pain and fear of death she endured alone from cancer flooded into me. I knelt on the ground, clutching the diary, crying in pain like a child. I finally went to that sea, which I had been too afraid to visit. I was afraid to remember how she looked when she died. Standing on the shore, the salty sea breeze brushed against my face, the deep blue waves rippling, causing a nauseating dizziness. Since nearly drowning at the age of 6, I had suffered from seasickness. And Irene died in the sea. The waves licked at my feet, as if beckoning me to venture deeper. 1 step. 2 steps. The last scene she saw before her death was a fireworks photo I posted on social media. I simply thought those colorful fireworks were similar to the aurora she wanted to see. But I didn't expect Kathy to like it. After that, in her mind, it turned into a romantic moment between me and Kathy. As the sea level crept higher towards me, a phone call startled me. When I came to, the seawater had already risen to my waist. I picked up my phone. It was my mom. I answered, muffling the microphone to block out the wind and waves. "What's wrong?" My mom's voice sounded tired. "I dropped a seashell when I was sleeping. It woke me up, and I suddenly wanted to call you." "When are you getting home?" "What do you want for dinner tonight, a seashell?" I paused. Yes, she had her loved ones who needed me to take care of them. "What's that sound in the background?" "Are you at the beach?" My mom asked, puzzled. "No." My voice was hoarse. "I'll be back soon." A few days later, I received a hesitant phone call. "Bro, it's me. There's something I might need to tell you. When we were at the pub before, we might have run into your sister-in-law." She looked really thin, and I didn't dare to recognize her. "We had a bit too much to drink and started talking about you. John brought up the drunken words you said to him in England. Something about being tired and fed up with your sister-in-law, and she seemed very upset after hearing that and left quickly. After hearing about my sister-in-law's death, I felt particularly uneasy. After thinking it over, I decided to tell you about that day." After hanging up the phone, I lowered my eyes. So that was the reason she decided to leave. That she would never know that when I returned that time, it was to propose to her. I was indeed tired. I was tired of constantly being envious behind their backs, tired of our strained relationship, tired of consuming each other. I wanted to ask her if she was willing to marry me, if she wanted to have a wedding with me in England. But she had already packed up everything and then broke up with me. I always thought she liked Calvin. She and Calvin's friendship had lasted for 10 years. If it wasn't for our relationship, if it wasn't for my parents, they probably would have been together long ago. So when she broke up with me, I naturally assumed she was leaving me for Calvin. It was only at this moment that I realized how much disappointment she had accumulated towards me. The time Kathy got a cold, and I draped my jacket over her, I saw the sadness in Irene's eyes, but I chose to ignore it. Because the night before, at the sports field, I saw her and Calvin. Calvin scored a goal, and she cheered excitedly. In that moment, I felt so jealous. My hands, damaged by nerve injury, couldn't play basketball anymore, and yet she ran off to watch someone else play. She clung to my arm weakly, and I even mocked her. To make me compromise, she used to often pretend to be sick. But I should have known that since the time she faked suicide to deceive me, she never dared to joke about her health again, and even when she was actually sick, she didn't dare tell me. While I took care of Kathy, she endured the pain of cancer alone. Calvin was right. I truly didn't deserve her. I didn't even have the right to die with her. She must have hated me. That's why, in her last words, she thought of everyone except me.